Okay, this is part 2 of Psalm 89, and I've thought about how to do this session, and it will be a little different from any of the sessions that we've done before. Instead of me working to pull the meaning out of the text and interpret it and apply it for you, I'm going to show you my process for how I try to think through that, especially on a longer text like this, because I think that's kind of essential for how I'm trying to teach these Psalms together, not just to interpret and apply for us, but also to try to help all of us be better at interpreting and applying the Psalms. So to do that, I'm relying on my tech gurus, Zach Lenhart and my dad, to get you a handout that you will need for this session to make sense for you. It should be available in a PDF or maybe an HTML web link so that you could either print this out if that works best for you, although you'd probably need a color printer, or you could look at it on your web browser or save it as a PDF document to open. So I hope I'm not pushing the bounds of what we are technologically capable of, either in distributing or for some of us in accessing. But I really think this could be a helpful exercise for some of you. This is similar to what we tried to do in our adult VBS class last year. And it's, I want to be clear, this isn't, the notes that you're about to look at aren't inspired. It's my attempt to tear into the text in a way that will help me see the themes and meanings and recurring ideas that point us all towards the big conclusions and the big theological truths. So if you don't have this up in front of you, go ahead and pause here, find this handout, and then we will resume. Okay, so with our handout in front of us, you will see as you scroll through all kinds of underlines and highlights and colors and notes, and you might well be wondering, what in the world is this mess? And that's fair, because there's not a great rhyme or reason to how I tend to mark these things up, because they're typically only supposed to have meaning to myself. But I wanna try to show you what these marks mean and how it helps to drive me towards the big picture meaning of this psalm. So really all this lesson will be is showing you my notes. And then the next 2 lessons after this will be me showing you how these notes, or really, I may not even refer to the notes out loud after this, but you might have them in front of you and see, well, this is why the covenant is such a central idea, or why these different structures refer back to each other. So today, looking through the notes, from there, interpreting and applying this psalm to our minds and our hearts. So you'll see, first of all, highlights throughout the psalm. Words like steadfast love, which, as I mentioned last time, is the Hebrew word chesed, which might be translated as mercies for some of you, or loving kindness sometimes in certain translations. In my translation, the ESV, it's often translated steadfast love. Again, as I mentioned all the way back at the beginning of this study together, I appreciate and enjoy the ESV for its attempt to get the strictest theological meaning out of a Hebrew word for us, but it doesn't always make for the most musical or melodic translation. I mean, mercies just sounds so much better to my mind if I'm thinking in song. But I think steadfast love might do a better job of getting the exact theological idea down. When I start studying a text, and especially a psalm, the first step that after I've read the text and kind of tried to think about, what is this talking about? What's the big idea here? The first way I try to kind of reaffirm my hypothesis of what the big idea is, or my gut take on it, is to look for the words or phrases that seem to have special meaning in the text. And in the Psalms, one of, if not the best way to find those words or phrases that have special meaning is to look for the words or phrases that are recurring. That's not necessarily true when you read something like Paul's epistles. There you might want to use the language of logic to look for the words or phrases that have special meaning. But in the Psalms, it's usually the recurring idea that has special meaning. So you can see that steadfast love and faithfulness and covenant and throne and this idea of a chosen one are all words or phrases that I highlighted in just this first verse, these first 4 verses for us. And then as you look throughout the other verses, you'll see, oh wow, these ideas really pop up all throughout the song that the psalmist is writing for us. You see faithfulness is here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times, and that's if I didn't miss any in my highlighting, which, by the way, I won't guarantee. You might leave your complaints with Cassandra on my inability to find certain phrases. And yes, I know I stole that joke from John, but I liked it. We see steadfast love is mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. And it's also interesting to note that it typically looks like it occurs right near the idea of faithfulness. Take verse 14, for example. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Steadfast love and faithfulness go before you. They're kind of a coupled idea often throughout this psalm. Look again in verse 24. My faithfulness and my steadfast love. That's worth noting, or that's something that stands out to me when I've got my highlighter out and I'm starting to think about these things. We see covenant in verse 3, also in verse 28, verse 34, and verse 39. And from there we start to get the idea that really the whole cause of this psalm is to do with how God is honoring, or in Ethan's mind and eyes, potentially not honoring the covenant that he made with David. We also see the chosen one, verse 3, verse 19, and verse 51. And these are important points within the psalm. The very beginning, the very beginning of a speech from God in verse 19, and the very end of the psalm in verse 51. Finally, I highlighted throne in purple in verse 4. Also shows up in verse 29, verse 36, and verse 44. So 4 instances of that. That's my first step, or that's what I did first. As I dug into the psalm more, there's more that I could have highlighted for sure. Another recurring word or phrase is offspring. That's quite clear throughout it. I also wondered if only highlighting the word throne was a little too narrow because there's other signs of kingship that are recurring throughout the psalm. Ideas of the horn, or I'm sorry, the crown, and I'm missing one other that I thought of recently, but those stood out to me as things that I didn't highlight. So by no means are the words and phrases that I highlighted the only words or phrases that are worth highlighting. I'd be curious, in fact, to hear from you other recurring ideas that stick out to you throughout this psalm. Many of them will be ideas of a royal nature, but there's other key theological words or phrases that I'm sure will stick out to you throughout. Righteousness and justice and a few others. Okay, from there, for me, what I do, especially in the Psalms, is I try to look for clumps or verses of texts that are made to work together in some poetic form. I know we don't know Hebrew poetry well, or at least I'm not aware that any of us do. I don't know it well, but poetry is poetry, and it works through figures of speech, and those figures of speech in the Psalms help guide us towards the big idea. So when you see underlined or boxed in chunks of text here, there's usually two of them that have the same notation. For example, 1 through 4 with this orange squiggly underline, and then verse 49 through 51 with this orange squiggly underline, and verses 5 through 9 or 5 through 12 with a triple underline is matched by verses 46 through 48 with a triple underline. If you go further down, verses 13 through 18 have this thin pencil underline, and then verses 38 through 45 have the same thin pencil underline. And if you were able to sit in on our VBS class, what you might be noticing is a structure starting to form in the psalm, or at least in the way that I see it. The only lines that are not underlined are verses 19 through 37. And these are a speech from God. The voice changes in verse 19. We see, of old you spoke in a vision to your godly one and said, and then I. That I is God's is God talking. It's Ethan imagining God laying out the Davidic covenant for David. And what I see happening is that this is the very center of his song, and these pairs of grouped texts on either side of it are what we call a chiasmatic structure. That's Chiasmatic, chiasmatic. And it's pairs of ideas that bounce off of each other and help explain one another. And often the way that they do that is in, if you can imagine, a V-shaped formation leading to the climax of the main point. And that's what you can see in this psalm happening. If verses 19 through 37 are the climax and the main point, you then have these paired texts or chunks, the pencil lines, the triple underlines, and the orange curvy underlines. These three groupings on either side of this main thought. And I know that I'm giving you underlined lines without really even explaining how they relate to each other, but let's start to do that. In verses 1 through 4, we see Ethan making a proclamation of saying, I'm going to sing of steadfast love and faithfulness forever. Because you said you were going to do this thing. You're going to make a covenant and keep it. Verses 49 through 51 is Ethan asking a question about the very subjects that he said he was going to sing about. Lord, where is your steadfast love of old? This is verse 49, which by your faithfulness you swore to David. So you see, on the one hand, I will sing of your steadfast love and of your faithfulness based off the promise that you made to David. And on the other hand, Lord, where is your steadfast love? A song and a question with the same subjects in mind. God's steadfast love and faithfulness based off of the covenant promise he made to David. That's one pairing of ideas that I see. Then in verses 5 through 12, we see Ethan praising God because of his greatness, his sovereignty, a set of principles that Ethan knows to be true about God's ruling his over creation, the sea, the waves, over nations, over the heavens, over the earth, over all the world, over the north and the south. These are things that God rules over, and he recognizes that. But what he recognizes in those is how that looks like faithfulness to his holy ones, to God's holy ones. But then in verses 46 through 48, there again seems to be a questioning of that very nature of God that he praises. How long, O Lord, will you hide yourself forever? In other words, it doesn't seem like you're ruling and raging against our enemies right now. In fact, your wrath is burning against us like fire. And I've said that you're going to rule forever and over all people, but I'm not going to live that long. What does this ruling look like for me, and when will it happen? So I see these as paired ideas. And then in verses 13 through 18, this is how the nature of God seems to relate to his relationship with Israel in verses 13 through 18. You have a mighty arm, strong as your hand, and this is good for us, the people who know the festal shout, who walk in the light of your face. Our shield belongs to the Lord, our King, to the Holy One of Israel. But in verses 38 through 45, Ethan points out it doesn't seem like you are in the mode of doing good to your nation Israel, to your people who live in the light of your face and who make you their shield and their horn of salvation. Instead, you've cast us off and you've rejected us and you're full of wrath against us. And it seems like you've renounced your covenant with your servant. You've allowed other people to lay us to ruins. What is going on here? And then in the very center of the psalm, again, you have the whole idea that Ethan is building the psalm around, which is, God, I know you made this promise, this covenant promise to David. So what does that mean for us? So I'm gonna actually use these notes to dig into the truths that Ethan is dealing with. But I want you to see how those structures really start to clarify what's going on here. And if you only read a psalm as linear or as progressive in what it's saying, it it's often not going to make sense to you, or you're going to feel like this writer is, off on a rabbit trail and not really chasing down one idea. Well, that's very rare for a psalm. The Psalms, even though they are songs, really are, and they're not just stream of consciousness, Bob Dylan type folk songs. They are focused on ideas and principles and truths that should be helping us know how to express ourselves to God. And so we can't always read them beginning to end and feel like there's a beginning, middle, and end as if it were just a story. No, these have forms and structures, and you don't need to be a poetic genius to find them, but you do need to slow down and start thinking about ideas and then seeing where those ideas relate to each other and starting to draw the connections together. I know some of you might think I'm a guy who enjoys technology, and to some extent that's true. But when it comes to reading, I genuinely dislike reading things digitally. I just love holding books. I love marking books up, and I love making notes and squiggly lines and stars and crazy notations that would mean nothing to anyone other than myself. But the one book that I read 95% digitally is the Bible. And that's for the simple reason that I can have my Bible with me wherever I am, on my computer or on my phone. And because of my work and what I do, either my computer or my phone are always before me. And I can make notes that transfer to all of my devices at the same time. And I can easily, when I'm working through a text like this, I can easily erase things when I realize, you know what, I think that's not the right connection to make here. And then I can reconfigure things and say, wait a minute, this idea lines up with this idea, not the other thing. And that has been incredibly invaluable to me, especially as a teacher, because it allows me to spend more time crossing things out, or not crossing them out, but erasing them and replacing them, that I wouldn't be able to do if I were working in paper. I'm not at all saying that means anyone should or shouldn't read their Bible digitally versus not. Again, I wish I could have the freedom to have 100 different Bibles, so that when I made mistakes in one, I could just renote it or something. But it's just more practical for me to do it this way. And so I'm thankful for Bible software that allows me to make these notes. The last set of notes that some of you, if you're still paying attention and your eyes haven't glazed over, might be noticing are these notes on the left margins. One of those is a sticky note. Unfortunately, you can't see what that means. A sticky note means an actual note that I write about what's happening. I think the sticky note before verse 19 says something like, note the change of voice. God himself is giving the statement of the covenant in this song. That's really important for me to make sure I don't skip over or miss when I'm reading this. So there's an actual written out note there for me to note that. But you'll see in verse 28, this red note on the left line, and then there's an arrow in verse 29, and then there's these boxed in lines in verse 31. And you'll see those three notations recur throughout the next 10 or so verses. And the reason for me is that I see these is that I see a parallelism between what's being talked about on a recurring basis here. In verse 28, 29, and 31, God is talking. And he says, I'll keep my steadfast love for him forever, and my covenant will stand firm for him, in verse 28. It seems to me like he reaffirms this in 37. Again, you see this eternality of his promise, right? It's eternal. The moon, like the moon, it shall be established forever, a faithful witness in the skies. But then the voice changes in verse 38, remember, and it seems as though Ethan instantly jumps on that idea as his first question to God, or his first note. Wait a minute, God. You said in verse 28, my steadfast love I'll keep forever, and my covenant will stand firm for him. And of course, he's already noted, I sing about your steadfast love. I sing of your mercies forever. I make known your faithfulness, especially because of your covenant. But, verse 38, but now, right here, in this moment, you have cast off and rejected. How is it, God, that this thing will last forever and ever, but it's not happening right now? That seems to be contradictory. Then you'll notice the left arrow pointer. Again, this is a recurring idea. I will establish his offspring forever, and his throne as the days of the heavens. So to get even more specific, this throne of David will go forever. Verse 36 says the same thing. His offspring will endure forever, his throne as long as the sun before me. But then verse 39, you have renounced the covenant with your servant. You have defiled his crown in the dust. And there you can see why I think crown should probably be highlighted in purple, because in all the other instances of this idea happening, there's a royal image. In all the others, it's throne, but in this one, it's a crown. But his crown is in the dust, and in verse 44, his throne is cast down to the ground. It's not elevated. So this is Ethan playing with this idea of God saying the throne will be established forever, but now it looks as though it's been cast down. Verse 31, if they violate my statutes and do not keep my commandments, then I will punish their transgression with the rod and the iniquity of the stripes. So it's this idea of violating commandments or promises. And we see it here in verse 31. We see God saying, I will not violate my covenant, in verse 34. But then in verse 40 and 41, you have breached all his walls. Breached and violated are the same idea, right? You've come right in uninvited and knocked us down, laid our strongholds in ruins. And not only that, you're allowing all who pass by to plunder him or to violate him, right? They are stealing from your people, from David's nation, and you're allowing this to happen. And so these parallel lines that I've noted here are significant to me in helping to understand what's the dynamic of Ethan's overarching idea. So what I've done for us here is shown you how I try to work through a psalm to make sure I'm not just glazing over and looking for the pretty words and looking for the word that matches a song that I've sung before, but instead really trying to get to the heart of it. And to do that, even in the Psalms, it takes some work. It takes some digging. It takes some scribbling. This is not a process that I'm A, advocating, or B, patenting. For some of you, this might work great. For some of you, hopefully, you've got a far better system. But what I do, and what I've just done for us, is I look for those key words or phrases. I highlight those. It starts to point me to the big idea. And then I look for structures that help focus in on reflecting ideas, or ideas that are made to point to an even bigger idea. From there, I look for little poetic structures like the parallels that we just looked at. Usually, when I take the time to dig into a psalm with those three steps, I come away with a much deeper understanding of what I'm supposed to know about God from this psalm, and what kind of confidence it gives me to know how to better approach him in my prayer and worship life. So the next two lessons, I'm going to continue to teach just like I would any of the other lessons that I've done so far, but they'll be based off of these notes. When I'm pointing to theological truths that Ethan is using to combat his own doubt and concern about God's goodness, I found those truths through digging into God's word using these tools. And I want all of us to be able to replace our fears with trust in God whose word we trust. And the only way to do that is to have tools for how to dig into this word together. So I hope this is helpful for some of you. I'm sure it probably isn't for all of you, but I couldn't figure out another way to try to explicitly point out how we could all dig into the Psalms even better than doing it on a psalm like this. So we'll dig in even more to Psalm 89 next time. Grace and peace to all of you through our God and Father and our Lord Jesus Christ.